Donald J. Trump, the most successful white-collar criminal in U.S. history and perhaps the world.
Do whatever you have to do. You say whatever you have to say. Winning is everything.
Donald Trump is a major deal maker, and he has made his money mainly from Manhattan real estate.
Corruption, white-collar crime, corporate crime, organized crime, and state crime, wanting to be accepted, wanting to be liked, always feeling as an outsider. Much of his life, he was a political joke.
Gregg Barak, author of Criminology on Trump.
Collusion with the Russians to interfere in the 2016 election.
Trump campaign chairman was in regular contact with a Russian operative during the 2016 campaign.
It's a masterful con job. They use violence mostly as intimidation. There isn't anyone prosecuting him who hasn't faced an avalanche of torment, threats on their life and their family. He uses that as any organized criminal does the same.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing just fine, Pete. How are you?
Amazing, amazing. So in a past episode, we had a discussion with Grace Blakely, and Grace was actually mentioning that one of the authors that she was particularly enamored by was yourself. We connected on LinkedIn. You sent me your latest book, and here we are today to go over the depths of what you've written and the insights shared. So I guess let's start with who you are, what you do, and why.
I came of age in the late 60s, early 70s at the University of California, where I did both my undergraduate and graduate studies at the Berkeley School of Criminology. At the time, it were the crimes against humanity and the structural crimes of capitalism, imperialism, racism, and sexism that were being emphasized and examined. I became a historian of crime and crime control. Over the past 50 years, I've lived and worked in 8 states, representing the Western, Eastern, Midwestern, Southern, and Northern regions of the United States. I've spent much of my career as a community activist, as well as a newsmaking criminologist with political issues having to do with hunger, homelessness, racial justice, and gendered violence. In detail, I've captured my professional background in Chronicles of a Radical Criminologist, published by Rutgers University Press in 2020. The book traces my journey as a student, a faculty member, and an administrator stretching over 5 decades. This criminological expedition begins in California during the 1960s, takes me from there to Pennsylvania, Nevada, Germany, Italy, and Oregon in the 1970s, and to Illinois and Alabama in the 1980s, and then to Michigan, Kentucky, Brazil, and back to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I've been mostly since the 1990s. You wanted to know what motivated me to write on Trump. As a scholar of state and corporate crime, as well as the originator of newsmaking criminology, I've always been preoccupied with the United States' absence of criminologists in the public domain, unlike in the UK or Europe, where criminologists have a fairly decent profile. Here in the States, we're generally left out of the conversations that deal with crime and justice. You hear more from historians, political scientists, and journalists than you do from criminologists. In that context, I've spent much of my academic life addressing this situation, mostly by writing commentaries about crime and justice. With respect to the most successful white-collar criminal in U.S. history and perhaps the world, Donald J. Trump, I wanted to make sure that criminologists had a voice in the public discussion. Unlike the coverage or analysis by journalists, lawyers, historians, and political scientists, I wanted to infuse the political and legal narratives with criminological knowledge of psychology, sociology, economics, and criminal justice. I wanted to in a way, used Trump as a vehicle, not necessarily the subject as much as the object of a case study, so that I could explain the inner workings or relationships between corruption, white-collar crime, corporate crime, organized crime, and state crime from the perspective of the development of crime, law, and social control.
When I read the book, I was blown away by the insight, but one of the key things that initially caught my eye was the specific criminology approach that you took in regards to analyzing Trump's actions and policies.
With respect to the policies, you need to understand Trump, because Donald knows very little about either domestic or international policy or politics. So what we're doing is showing how he, in effect, although he's successful at what he does, he has no ideological foundation. He's not left or in the middle. He's just transactional. He's more about creating a narrative. The policies are aspects of how he utilizes power and how he manipulates people and things. For example, he created a situation where you had to pay to play. Didn't matter if you were an individual, a foreign agent, or a foreign diplomat. You had to come into his world and begin making payments. Not necessarily bribes, but hanging out in his country club, hanging out at the Washington Hotel a few blocks away, where he spent most of his time as president, down the street from the Oval Office. So he would be selling policy to lobbyists across the whole ideological perspective. The policies that he incorporates were the ones that he felt could deconstruct the state, delegitimate democracy, take an opposing side to the history of the United States foreign policy. So he's really outside of the box, although most of the things that he does, almost all of the things he does, benefit either the rich or the white Christian nationalist silent majority in this country. I thought before we got there that I would take your viewers into Donald as a child, showing how he became who he is, what his beliefs and values are from his inception as a youngster who basically was not necessarily a delinquent, but he had an aggressive, assertive personality where, for example, at 6, he hit his teacher upside the head in front of a classroom of first graders, primarily because he didn't like his teacher's taste in music. By the time Donald was 13, his parents, again, who, was not a very closely knit family. His mother was distant from not only Donald, but all of her children. She had her own physical ailments to contend with. And the father was a patriarch, chauvinistic, racist, misogynist individual. And in that context, he was sent away to reform school or to the New York Academy because of his disciplinary issues. He left there and graduated from there after 5 years. But throughout his whole life, he was dependent on his father's fortune. And he was an apprentice of sorts to his father, picking up his attitudes, his behaviors, not necessarily his skills as a builder, but his political savvy. And he built his empire, Fred Sr., governmental money, because he was well connected politically. But he, like his son, detested the idea of having to ever pay tax. So he invented ways of not paying taxes and passing his wealth on to his children, which primarily benefited Donald. Donald was the heir apparent in that family. He never was very much approved or liked by his parents, especially his mother. So all of this creates a Donald Trump wanting to be accepted, wanting to be liked, always feeling as an outsider. Much of his life, he was a political joke for decades. At the same time, much of his life was engaging in various business enterprises, most of which were not very successful. He inherited more money than he made. And his father bailed him out over and over, invested in Trump because he wanted to expand his own fortune. And Donald became the primary vehicle for that. And Donald turned around and became very politically connected, not only with government and politicians, but with labor leaders, with organized criminal leaders who were controlling the trades in building in New York when he was coming of age.
That whole family dynamic it's not often articulated, but the experiences of which we grow up with as we develop from a young age through to our adulthood, they do shape and form. We're often creatures of our own experiences. It's important to share that narrative. And also, why do you believe as well, especially in the run-up to his first term, why do you believe that he resonated with the American population in such a way that it ultimately led him to become the president of the US?
Because he was able to conjure up the narrative of the self-made billionaire who, through hard work and initiative, built an empire. That, coupled with the fact that the only real money that he ever earned in his life was off of The Apprentice, the Celebrity Apprentice, the television shows that ran for about a decade. That's the only substantial income he generated on his own. That allowed him to become a household word. But even before then, he still had a large public profile. And then he took on the image of the outsider, representing people who were aggrieved and put down because they weren't politically correct, they weren't woke. So he galvanized those people. Had he never had the Apprentice television show, he would have never become president. That was really his venue to becoming a presidential candidate, which he toyed with the idea off and on since the 1980s. Mm-hmm. Trump's been weaponizing the law for personal and political gain throughout his entire life, primarily as a plaintiff in civil litigation. And he has done so as a means of derailing his actual or potential opponents, adversaries, or enemies, whether they are from the world of business, politics, media, or entertainment. In other words, suing and countersuing to the tune of more than 3,000 lawsuits. You can't find an attorney who's litigated that many lawsuits. You certainly can't find an individual who has in their course of life engaged in 100 lawsuits, let alone 3,000. So suing and countersuing has been his way of showing people that Donald is not to be messed with. Even if you defeat him, which doesn't happen very often, you usually will come away harmed and injured in spite of your victory. It's the same mentality in the way in which he took over the Republican Party, was able to get the Supreme Court to do his bidding. This is all part of the way in which he's weaponized through the law, using the law, exploiting the law, profoundly been successful doing that. So much so that he's now getting off with full criminal immunity and it's very unlikely that he'll be prosecuted for any of these cases.
What about some specific examples?
In relationship to the Department of Justice's investigation into Trump's collusion with the Russians and his various efforts to interfere in the 2016 election, the former president not only pardoned his convicted campaign conspirators, but he also filed a major lawsuit in 2022 in the Southern District of Florida, charging Hillary Clinton, his presidential opponent, the Democratic National Committee, former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, and various other people with attempting to rig the 2016 election by tying his campaign to Russian meddling. His lawsuit alleged that these defendants engaged in precisely what Donald is doing. In every lawsuit, people like to say, gee, he's projecting. He's not projecting. He's just accusing them of what he is doing and getting most people to believe him rather than the state. It's a masterful con job. And through this weaponization, he's drifted campaign financing. So he has 3,000 workers out there today canvassing and getting out votes through non-for-profit political entities that legally are not allowed to be doing this. And they're spending $100 million. He's weaponizing campaign financing. So in the lawsuit, he's charging the defendants of engaging in conspiracy and racketeering. He's the racketeer, but he's suing people for racketeering. But what he did is, let me quote from that lawsuit. Acting in concert, the defendants maliciously conspired to weave a false narrative that their Republican opponent, Donald J. Trump, was colluding with a hostile foreign sovereignty. Of course, there was nothing false about the narrative, as the special counsel Robert Mueller's numerous criminal convictions proved, including 5 campaign officials from his team who were convicted and subsequently pardoned by Trump.
Let's talk a little bit about the Mueller Report, because not everybody's up to speed.
The Mueller Report was investigating whether or not Donald colluded with the Russians to interfere with the 2016 election. So there was an investigation during the Trump administration, and lo and behold, they indicted many Russian actors who they didn't prosecute because they were out of the country, and they prosecuted and convicted 5 members of Trump's campaign. So in essence, he's flipping the narrative, just as he's flipping the narrative now that it's the deep state that's going after him, that they want to keep him out of the election. He wants to talk about a Biden crime family when he operates a criminal enterprise for decades, which now includes the Republican Party and the MAGA majority of the Supreme Court.
The thing that I can never get my head around is, why does the narratives that Trump narrates land so evidently well with large proportions of the American population?
Because they believe in conspiracy or not conspiracy theories, that there's a global elite out there. And that elite in the United States has been calling the shots, establishing policy, creating what's politically correct, voting rights, individual rights. And he is the warrior against that. He is the outsider, even though he's been using and exploiting that his entire life. He's able to make people think, no, that's not him. He's the savior, and he's being persecuted because he's got their interests in place.
Maybe touch upon more so the broader implications this has upon the American political system.
It's about corruption, corrupting the political, legal, and economic systems. If you can take those over, the state is just a weapon that you can use. When it comes to corruption and state organized abuses of power, Trump checks off all the boxes and then some. He engages in every form of advanced capitalist corruption as opposed to third world corruption, because he's using and employing oligarchs, plutocrats, and kleptocrats, not only from Russia and other parts of the world, but right here in the United States, as Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, would argue. So part of his abilities to do these things has to do with the fact that he has incorporated this type of juice, force, power, and money. And he has brought those things together, so much so that even though in terms of that discussion, several times after his second impeachment and after the insurrection failed and the coup, you had everyone in the Republican Party ready to do him in. It only took him a couple of days to get them all back in order. And anyone who challenged him, their days were numbered. They're over. So he's got the whole Republican Party, except for 20% of the old rhinos who are still around trying to talk about Reagan and Bush. He has all the others right in his hand. And he's doing what one needs to do. He's creating state-abused power legitimately by taking his people up and down the country, mostly in red or conservative states, and he's taking over offices at the local level, at the school board level, at the county level, at the mayor's level, at the state. So he has former election deniers, and he has former people prosecuted and convicted on January 6th who have already been put in office in various places. So you have secretaries of state now in a few states that are election deniers, and they're going to be the ones counting the votes in 2024. That's his ability to abuse power. He does it through the law. In other words, they don't want to be violent. They use violence mostly as intimidation. There isn't anyone prosecuting him or judging him who hasn't faced an avalanche of torment by text, by phone, by person, threats on their life and their family. He uses that as any organized criminal does the same, only he's far better at it than anyone else has ever been.
So in that regard, where does that leave the Republican Party in general and broader America?
It's strange. The Democrats are totally outraged. They believe that this man, like the law says, if you engage in an insurrectionary act, Colorado concluded, New Hampshire concluded that he should be disqualified for running. But the Supreme Court said, oh, no, that's okay. That doesn't apply. Bullshit. Of course it applies. He should have already been out of the race. But when you got the Supreme Court saying you can do this, when you got the Supreme Court saying that creating a conspiracy and failing to finish a coup d'etat is part of your official business, why shouldn't he use the law? He's winning with the law. He's not losing. So the Democrats believe he should be in jail. He shouldn't be running, open and shut. And aside from his criminality, he was a disaster with COVID. 1 million people died. Half of them didn't need to die if it wasn't for him. On the other hand, I must say that he did get the vaccine created in record time, but he killed 500,000 people needlessly. In terms of taxes and money and business, even before COVID, he created the biggest debt in the history of any president. He had no health policy. He deregulated all of the environment. He just on and on did reprehensible things. Where does that leave the Republicans who aren't Trumpists? The Republicans are a small knit group today with virtually little to no power. Their best things are online, talking about the situation and how Donald isn't fit to be and how this isn't the Republican Party. I know you're right. The GOP doesn't exist for all intensive purposes. It's the Trumpian party at this point in time. And the threat for the United States, it's enormous. You have the rule of law, democracy on the line. If Trump prevails, the United States becomes an authoritarian, illiberal, quote unquote, democracy, if you can even use that. That's what's at stake here.
One of the things I also want to delve a little bit back into some of the major legal battles, such as the people of the state of New York versus Donald Trump, and how I guess some of these cases are impacting public perception and legal precedents regarding Trump.
Your listeners, your viewers, they probably know that he was convicted for one of the criminal indictments and found guilty of 34 felonies related to payments to a porn star that he slept with while his wife was pregnant. But that wasn't really what the case was about. It was about a conspiracy to manipulate news about his opponents, Republican or Democratic, especially Hillary Clinton, but his primary rivals in that campaign. So he conspired with a tabloid to put out all these false stories about his opponents. At the same time, he worked with those to capture and suppress stories of his own. So it was about how he conspired to not let some of his sexual escapades out at the time just before the election was to come through. So he basically interfered with the 2016 election. So that's what that case was about. But moving on to the more significant, if that's a proper word, 3 of the 4 criminal indictments involved conspiracies to illegally interfere and overturn a presidential election. We talked about one of those, the one in 2016. He also is being prosecuted in Washington, D.C., and being prosecuted under the Racketeering Act, or RICO, in Georgia for conspiring to steal and overturn an election. And then the final case, on his way out of office, he stole classified documents and has been charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice under the Espionage Act. The nuclear codes, all of these things just hanging out at his place in Miami. Perceptions. They're divided pretty much by party, with Republicans thinking that there was either nothing criminal here and are busy following the whitewashing of what occurred. They're trying to normalize this, trying to undo the history of what occurred. They're already passed a law that says some of the people convicted on January 6th were falsely or incorrectly charged. Or if they didn't think that he did anything, they feel his crimes were justified because of what was done to him, and that he's a victim, and that he's a patriot, and that he's an outlaw, he's a revolutionary, and this is what they're doing to him. Flipping that, and you have the Supreme Court, MAGA supermajority, who ruled July 1 that presidents have full immunity from criminal prosecution.
I guess before we dive into the next part of it, how many people did Donald Trump put within the Supreme Court during his time?
He put 3 in there, and he takes credit for putting those 3 in. Most of the decisions that are coming down, such as this one about being criminally immune to prosecution, was a 6-3 vote. There were 5 different opinions. Typically, when you have something that rewrites the Constitution, that in effect nullifies Article 2 of Section 2 of the Constitution, you should have a 9-0 decision. You shouldn't have 5 decisions. And that's because it's a poppycock decision. There's nothing there in terms of what they've manufactured to protect him. That said, after this decision, if we go back in history before you were around, I'm sure Richard Nixon, who resigned the presidency, would have never resigned the presidency. And what he told David Frost in his exclusive interview 3 years after he resigned office in 1977, when Frost asked him about breaking the law and in relationship to his belief that what he was doing was for the interest of the country, what did he legendarily reply? If the president does it, it's not illegal. He foresaw what the Supreme Court would write 47 years later. And of course, the Democrats believe the court is part of the problem. The Republican Party, the Trumpian Party, are outrageous from their perception.
Before we move on to today, I remember when January 6th occurred and people all over the world were tuning in and looking at what was occurring in America in disbelief, to be honest. What were the, in your opinions, and I guess also touching upon your book, what were the key events that led up to that assault on Capitol Hill, and also what were the resulting factors and consequences in regards to what occurred?
Okay, the insurrection wasn't spontaneous. It was the end product of years propagating disinformation about rigged and stolen elections that began after the 2016 election and early in 2017, when Trump started explaining why he lost by 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton. And his explanation had to do with dead people and illegal immigrants voting. So that's where he began getting people accustomed to the idea that our elections were rigged or stolen. He picked up that narrative 6 months before the election in 2020. He began talking about illegal voting and attacking voting by mail. He began to attack drop-off boxes that were used to cast votes during the pandemic. So he began getting people used to the idea. His side bought into that idea. Despite after he announced that he won on election night, even before the votes were all counted, he filed some 60 lawsuits charging fraud and rigging elections and lost all of those. That didn't matter. And then he had a plan of conspiring across 7 states, the swing states, to have fake electors come in and vote for him over the real electors voting for how the election turned out. And that was the plan. Although they were preparing a march on the Capitol, whether it would be violent or not was up to Vice President Pence, who would not go along with not certifying the case and using fake electors. So when he refused to do that, then they went on the assault of the Capitol and all hell broke loose. Consequently, as I said earlier, initially Republican leadership was appalled. But even though Republican leadership was appalled, and I'm talking primarily in the upper house, or the Senate, not in the House of Representatives, because even though there was no stolen election, no rigging or fraud, 145 of the House Republicans, more than half of the House Republicans, voted not to certify the election. And many of the Senate representatives and senators were also co-conspirators. Ron Johnson of Wisconsin was a co-conspirator senator. So initially, the leadership, the 8 leaders of the up and down chambers immediately met and were prepared to impeach and get him out. But within about 72 hours, the Republicans backed away and became part of his army.
Do you think that backing away comes down to self-interest and the fear of losing power?
Yeah, clearly it's self-interest and fear of power. You have to understand that a sizable percentage of Republicans retired. Rather than go along with Trump, they left politics altogether. So you still had a sizable number of elected Republicans who left office. Those who turned on Trump were pushed out of office, and the rest remained for selfish reasons. Also, many of them, we are told, who were prepared to vote to impeach Trump in February of 2021, following the insurrection a month earlier, said they did not do so for fear of what would happen to them or their family members.
That brings me into the next question. So looking at the threat to democracy as a whole and scaremongering specifically, and also I guess like the conspiracy theories that we've discussed, how do you feel rather has that contributed to the current crisis in US democracy?
To me, it's the backbone, the skeleton, the heart, and the soul of the threat to democracy. It's what that threat is all about, and it's linked to think tanks and organizations who have put together a project called 2025, which The Guardian has probably covered that in some detail in the UK, I suspect. Are you and your viewers familiar with Project 2025?
I know a little bit, but I think for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, it's good to dive into.
It's like an authoritarian or fascist takeover of our government. It will do away with the civil service. It will replace them with Trump loyalists. We're talking 30,000 employees. It will do away with the Department of Education. It will do away with environmental protection altogether, which was sanctified the other day by another 6-2 decision by the Supreme Court that now doesn't leave agencies determining policy, but will leave it to the Supreme Court to decide what is climate change and what we should do about it. Those are Project 2025. It might help by concluding this way and talk about how that project is emblematic of the so-called platform of the Republican Party. And don't know if you are aware of the platform that has come out. Should the insurrectionists in chief return to the Oval Office, Trump's party's platform consists of 20 items where they lay out loud and clearly what they're never going to accomplish, and even if they wanted to, and many things which they have no interest in accomplishing. So let me run through quickly. They want to seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. There is no migrant invasion if you look around today. There's no migrant invasion, but they're going to stop it anyway. They want to carry out the largest deportation operation in American history, turning out about 50,000 people. They want to end inflation and make America affordable again. America has the lowest inflation in the world, but it's still too high at 3 or 4%. Wouldn't UK and Europe and the rest of the world love to have that type of inflationary problem? They want to make America the dominant energy producer in the world. We already pretty much are the dominant energy producer in the world. They want to stop outsourcing and turn the United States into a manufacturing superpower. Donald did no such thing whatsoever his first term in office in that direction. On the contrary, All he did was create tariffs that were passed on to people, so they paid more for things. They want large tax cuts for workers and no taxes on tips. Sounds good, but the same taxes that are about to run out that benefited 90% of the super wealthy and 10% of the people were offset by the fact that these tariffs, in effect, put a 10% surcharge on everything that people consume. So they ended up losing money. I could go on. They want to end the weaponization of government against the American people. There's no weaponization of government against the American people. There's only the weaponization of Donald Trump against democracy and the American people. They want to stop the migrant crime epidemic, demolish the foreign drug cartels, crash gang violence, and lock up violent offenders. First of all, migrants' rate of criminality is far lower than residents of the United States. There's no crime wave that comes with migrant workers. They want to keep the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Okay, there's one thing I agree with, and I suspect whether that succeeds or doesn't succeed has more to do with Brazil and India and other nations than it does with the United States. Here's an interesting one. Aside from doing away with the Department of Education, they want to cut federal funding for any school that teaches critical race theory, radical gender ideology, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content to our children. They want to keep men out of women's sports. They want to unite the country by bringing it to new and record levels of success. Our economy has never been better. And as we all know, around the world, incumbents are losing in every country, regardless of good, bad, or excellent records. Biden has a superb record. He's done more in 3.5 years than his 6 predecessors combined.
Listening and also reflecting, we talked about oligarchy and autocracy, and I guess like even this mindset that is being driven out of those particular narratives. Where have people seen parallels before, and what did that result into? And also from the long-term effects, where does that leave America?
The short answer to that is the Republicans preceding Trump have done a wonderful job of brainwashing Americans against Democrats. But going back to where are we at politically, if Trump wins, it's disaster, and it's a demise of democracy and a rise of autocracy. If Biden or his replacement wins, then we go back to the system that brought us here in the first place with all of its flaws, and pretty much our American democracy will still be primarily not a direct democracy, but it'll be a democracy by a minority. It'll be a democracy where you can win the popular vote with 6 million more voters than your opponent, but you lose the electoral college and you're not president. You got to do away with that system. That system was created because of slavery. It's outdated, it's outmoded, but it's an advantage for the Republicans because the Republicans have only won the popular vote once in the last 30 years. They can't win without the electoral college. So we need to do away with the electoral college. We need to amend our Constitution to make it much more participatory and serving and representing majority. That opportunity, and many people are engaged in efforts to do these things and much more, is underway. But it doesn't have the support of the leadership in the Republican or Democratic parties that are built on financially based elections, so that we spend billions of dollars and it's all about money, and that determines the outcome of elections. We have to go to public elections. We have to have elections that don't take 2 years, but take 6 weeks or up to a few months, like most of the rest of the world. Our system of electing people and representation needs much fixing. Our constitutions and the ability of citizens to participate statewide is much superior to our ability to engage and participate in the federal government or in the U.S. government. So we need a lot of changes. Those are possible, and people are down with that, except for the powerful politicians who will lose their seniority, lose their clout, and they're keeping that in check along with the Supreme Court. So those possibilities exist. I hold out some hope for that, but I suspect if the Democrats win, that we'll be so pleased, we'll think that our system is great. But no, it'll just get us back to where we've been for 200 plus years.
So there's some examples of reform that could be proposed to enhance the justice and strengthen the democracy within the United States. But maybe give some further examples that you would look based on your experience, based on your insight, and how feasible may these be? Because if you look to the UK recently, for example, the UK recently voted in by huge majority a Labour government on the premise of one simple slogan, change. But then you also see the risk of the right throughout the world. And yeah, I think there is a clamoring for change, but ultimately, what other proposed reforms would you look to implement and why? And I guess like how feasible these may be.
If we're ever to have unfettered, free, and fair elections, not dependent primarily on money, then there are several constitutional legislative reforms that are called for. These include, but are not limited to, abolishing, as I mentioned, the Electoral College, amending the constitutional amending process, which has stagnated and only has been amended like 25 times over all those years. We need to amend that process so that amendments can happen. We need to expand the number and establish term limits for Supreme Court justices. We need to reject the decision of the 2010 Citizens United and pass federal and state laws prohibiting private and corporate funded elections while adopting some type of mandatory system of publicly funded elections. In combination, these proposed legal changes and reforms would enable a new and improved multicultural and inclusive constitutional democracy that would be directly representative of the majority and not the minority of American people. As Matt Lewis has explained in Filthy Rich Politicians, Americans could achieve a political accountability from their elected leaders by way of common sense reforms. Unfortunately, many of the quote unquote ruling class elites from both parties have a vested interest in rejecting these reforms because as the richer candidates get reelected, the richer they become and the longer they stay in office. And the longer they stay in office, the more powerful they become. One way to prevent this vicious cycle from recurring would be to establish congressional term limits in both the House and the Senate. They're all possible. They're all reasonable changes that if you put it to the vote of the American people, they would be behind each and every one of those. It wouldn't even be close.
Looking forward, what do you see the future of American democracy in this context of the current political landscape? And how can people, not just in America, but further afield, how can we draw lessons from Trump's presidency and future candidacy to inform politics and actions worldwide?
As you yourself know, the authoritarian movements in the United States are mirroring and echoing the authoritarian movements throughout Europe and much of the world. What are the lessons? I don't know that our lessons are that more unique than the lessons they just learned in France. that if the people in the middle and the left organize, they can whip the people on the right. That seems to be a lesson, and that's probably the case. On the other hand, in terms of Trump, we will learn whether a fascist authoritarian takeover is possible, even in a place like the United States. It's hard to say what those lessons will be without knowing how this ends, how the election plays out. The lesson should be that we only got in this situation because we had a flawed system of government and a flawed system of elections and a flawed system that needed reform. That should be the lesson. Many people understand that. They all thought that the guardrails held and the courts ruled that there was no cheating. No, it didn't hold at all. On the contrary, they went forward and did worse things and got a free pass from the Supreme Court for doing so. So what is the lesson? The lesson is you got to transform the Supreme Court system. You got to transform the political system. If you don't, there'll be the next person to represent Project 25 and plutocrats and others.
I could talk to you all day. I've really enjoyed today's conversation. Before we close out, what do you feel within your gut, within your head, that lies ahead for America? And also, what do you feel your key thoughts and takeaway would be that you'd like to leave with our audience?
When I put to rest the books that we're talking about, I thought that we would have a landslide victory for the Democrats, the likes of which we hadn't seen since Lyndon Johnson devastated Barry Goldwater back in 1964. That's where my head was at when I finished the second book on Trump some 6 months ago. I guess the thing that was the most disturbing from me, when I wrote these books about Trump's crimes over a course of about 5 years, the two books, I had never imagined in my wildest imagination that the Supreme Court of the United States would rule on behalf of Donald Trump and against the Constitution. Our legal system needs a lot of work. It's mind-blowing that we find ourselves in this situation. My takeaway is if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. But in truth, having lived and worked in Germany, Italy, and Brazil, there are other systems of legality that are better than our own. Here in the United States, we think we got the greatest system in the world. I don't think it's true. France was able to hold off. The UK was able to come with labor. Here in the United States, I'm not sure we can pull that off. And those are parliamentary systems. I'm not calling for a parliamentary system, but I'm calling to end a binomial system of politics and infuse it with a multi-party system.
Gregg, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Pete. I really appreciate it.